The sun was a physical presence over the Texas plains, a merciless, brilliant disk in a bleached white sky. It hammered down upon the earth, raising shivering waves of heat from the parched, cracked soil. From the back of a dusty U.S. Army truck, a group of German prisoners of war disembarked, their movements slow and weary. The crunch of their worn jackboots on the sun-baked gravel was the only sound that broke the heavy, heat-soaked silence. These men, soldiers of the Wehrmacht, veterans of the scorching deserts of North Africa and the frozen hells of the Eastern Front, had mentally prepared themselves for the archetypal prison camp. Endless coils of barbed wire, grim-faced guards in watchtowers with machine guns, and a future of harsh punishment and starvation rations. Their reality was cattle. A figure detached itself from the shimmering heat haze, a ranch foreman whose silhouette was defined by a wide-brimmed Stetson. He moved with a languid rolling gait that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. A lasso was coiled and slung over his shoulder as casually as another man might carry a briefcase. He approached the disoriented group, tipped his hat back on his forehead, revealing a face tanned and creased like old leather, and through a young, nervous army translator, delivered a message that struck the prisoners with the force of a physical blow. "You boys will be helping us work the ranch," he drawled, his eyes scanning the line of dusty, uncertain faces. "Fence mending, cattle drives, whatever needs doing. We've got a war on, and the work don't stop." The Germans exchanged glances of profound disbelief. These were men who had fought under the swastika, who had endured the thunder of Stuka dive bombers, the clanking advance of panzer divisions, and the terrifying chaos of urban combat. They had faced down Allied forces with machine guns and panzerfausts, and now, in this surreal, sun-drenched landscape, their new battlefield was an endless expanse of open range. The weapons of this war were not Mausers or MP40s, but work gloves, worn leather, and wire cutters. The shouting, iron-fisted sergeants of their past were replaced by soft-spoken, squinting cowboys who measured a man's worth not by his political allegiance or the medals on his uniform, but by a more fundamental, primal metric: how well he could saddle a horse, mend a break in a fence line, or wrestle a stubborn steer. One young prisoner, a boy from the Rhineland, barely 20 years old, simply stared, his jaw slack at the horizon. The land stretched out before him, an immense, rolling sea of grass and scrub under an infinite dome of sky. It was bigger, more vast, and empty than anything his European mind could have ever conceived. Another prisoner, an older corporal from a Bavarian farm, whispered to the man beside him, his voice thick with a confusion that bordered on awe, "Mein Gott, this isn't imprisonment. This is another life." Within days, the surreal became their routine. They found themselves rattling across the prairie in the beds of battered Ford pickup trucks, the wind whipping at their hair. They learned to trail vast, lowing herds of cattle under the blazing sun, their uniforms growing dark with sweat. They watched the American cowboys with a kind of mesmerized fascination as these men communicated with their horses and the cattle through a complex, unintelligible language of whistles, clicks, and sharp, guttural calls that seemed as natural as breathing. They were paid not in currency, but in canteen tokens, scrip that could be exchanged for cigarettes, chocolate, and soda pop. They were given hearty, abundant meals that defied all their expectations of prison fare. They were even allowed moments of startling, unregimented freedom, sitting by a creek after a long day's work, sharing a coffee with a guard. Scenarios unthinkable in the rigid, paranoid hierarchy of a world at war. For these German soldiers, Texas was not merely a geographic location of captivity. It was a profound, disorienting culture shock, a violent and bewildering collision between the ordered, ancient world of Europe and the mythic, sprawling reality of the American Wild West. And as they slowly, awkwardly adjusted to the rhythms of this strange new cowboy life, a dawning, shocking realization began to permeate their ranks. The Americans, these ranchers and farmers were not the brutal, degenerate enemies that the relentless drumbeat of Nazi propaganda had promised. They were, in their own way, just men. Men who needed capable hands to work the land, not a vessel for ideological hatred. What began as sheer, unadulterated disbelief would soon evolve into one of the most unusual and quietly transformative stories to emerge from the entire Second World War. The journey from dread to disbelief. For the German soldiers captured in the shifting sands of North Africa or the rugged mountains of Italy, the long journey to the American mainland was a voyage steeped in dread. The propaganda films and party missives had painted a very specific picture of the United States, a chaotic, lawless nation, a crumbling judo-plutocracy riven by internal strife and racial conflict, a culture devoid of history or honor. They expected to be delivered into the hands of brutal, vengeful captors who would subject them to starvation, humiliation, and likely summary execution. The Geneva Convention was a vague concept, a promise they had little faith their enemies would honor. Instead, as the massive troop transport ships nudged into the bustling ports of Houston or Galveston, and as the prisoners were loaded onto trains with barred windows for the journey into the Texas interior, a different reality began to impose itself. Through those grimy windows, they saw not a nation in chaos, but a land of almost unimaginable peace and prosperity. They watched endless fields of wheat and cotton roll by, saw sprawling ranch lands dotted with thousands of head of healthy cattle, and passed through small, tidy towns where children played freely in front yards and shopkeepers waved from their porches. The prisoners, many of whom came from cities now being pounded into rubble by Allied bombers, were forced to confront a painful truth. The American homeland was untouched by the war's physical devastation. The fear of what awaited them now became mingled with a gnawing, unsettling envy. When the trains finally hissed to a stop near the dusty, windswept towns of Central and West Texas, the prisoners braced themselves for the final, grim sight of the prison camp. Yes, the camps, places like Camp Hearn, Camp Huntsville, and the larger Camp Swift, were indeed fenced and patrolled by armed guards. But what truly shocked them was the world that existed just outside the wire. It was not a barren no-man's land, but a working, breathing, immense landscape of ranch land that stretched to the very curve of the earth, all of it filled with cattle that required tending. On that first bewildering day of work assignment, the cognitive dissonance for the PSWs was nearly total. The men who greeted them weren't stern military policemen, but ordinary cowhands in denim jeans, scuffed boots, and those ubiquitous Stetsons. They were men whose faces were mapped by sun and wind, who carried ropes and branding irons instead of rifles, and who spoke with a slow, melodic drawl that was initially incomprehensible to the German ear. One prisoner, a man named Heinrich Keller, would later recall in a post-war memoir, "We were certain, in our hearts, that we would be treated like animals, beaten, and worked to death. Instead, they treated us like farmhands who simply happened to speak another language. It was humiliating and liberating at the same time. We had been prepared for hatred, and were completely disarmed by this pragmatic indifference." This fundamental misconception, of course, ran in both directions. Many Texans, their views shaped by wartime newsreels and patriotic posters, expected the German PSWs to be fanatical, goose-stepping Nazis, ideologically hardened supermen who might snarl or lash out with violence at any moment. But what they saw stepping off those trucks were thin, tired, and often very young men, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. They looked more like conscripted farm boys than the master race of Aryan legend. The Texans were often taken aback by how polite, disciplined, and even deferential many of the Germans initially were when faced with the prospect of honest physical labor. This collision of mutually false expectations created an atmosphere thick with uncertainty and watchfulness in those first weeks. The Germans didn't know whether to resist this strange new reality or to comply with it. The Texans didn't know if these enemy soldiers could be trusted not to sabotage equipment or attempt escape. But the land itself, with its relentless and immediate demands, would brook no such hesitation. Fences, broken by a storm, had to be repaired before the herd scattered. Cattle, growing restless, had to be driven to new pasture. The timeless, unyielding rhythm of ranch life began to break down these ideological and cultural barriers faster than any speech or military order ever could. And so began one of the strangest, most quietly profound chapters of the war. German prisoners of war, men once trained to kill Americans, now found themselves herding American cattle under the vast, unforgiving Texas sun. The unlikely labor force, a logistical masterstroke. By 1943, the United States faced a logistical problem of a scale and nature that few planners had anticipated at the war's outset. What to do with the overwhelming and ever-growing influx of Axis prisoners? From the deserts of Tunisia to the hills of Sicily and the beaches of Normandy, Allied armies were capturing tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers in vast encirclements and surrenders. Great Britain, serving as the primary staging ground for the European theater, was already overcrowded with PSWs. Its own resources stretched perilously thin by years of blockade and bombardment. The solution, though audacious, was clear. Ship them across the Atlantic, far from any active front lines, to a nation with ample space, abundant food, and a secure homeland. Texas, with its wide-open spaces, its robust agricultural economy, and its relative isolation, became one of the primary destinations. By the war's end, nearly 50,000 German PSWs were held across the Lone Star State, dispersed among several dozen main camps and hundreds of smaller satellite branch camps adjacent to the farms and ranches that needed their labor. Contrary to the barbed wire nightmares the Germans had steeled themselves for, these camps were constructed and operated in strict compliance with the Geneva Convention. The prisoners were provided with adequate and often quite reasonable shelter, food, medical care, and even opportunities for education, sports, and artistic pursuits. For many of these men, particularly those who had endured the brutal privations of the Eastern Front, life in a Texas PSW camp offered a level of physical comfort and security they had not known for years. But the most surprising and defining aspect of their captivity was the work program. The United States was in the grip of a severe domestic labor crisis. With millions of American men serving overseas in the armed forces, the farms and ranches that formed the backbone of the nation's agricultural output were struggling desperately to maintain production. In response, Congress authorized the use of prisoner labor, and the Army struck agreements with local farmers and ranchers. Prisoners could be hired out for agricultural work, with wages paid directly to the U.S. government. In exchange, the PSWs received a small daily allowance, usually around 80 cents, credited to them in canteen tokens for use in the camp store. For the Texans, this arrangement was nothing short of a lifeline. They desperately needed strong hands to harvest the immense cotton crops, to cut sugarcane, and, in the vast cattle country of the region, to help with the endless duties of ranch life. Branding, castrating, dehorning, driving, and mending the miles of fence that kept the herds contained. For the German prisoners, it was a bewildering and surreal turn of events. One day, a man could be fighting under Rommel in the desert, and the next, he was bouncing in the back of a flatbed truck on his way to mend a fence line in the heart of West Texas. The sight of German soldiers, in their distinct field gray uniforms, often dyed a darker hue to distinguish them from U.S. uniforms, working the land became a common, almost routine sight across rural Texas. Locals would watch them fixing irrigation ditches, carrying heavy bales of hay, or driving cattle under the watchful but often relaxed eyes of a handful of armed guards. What astonished many Texans was not just the prisoners' willingness to work, but how quickly and competently many of them adapted. A significant number of the PSWs had grown up on farms and in small villages in Germany. They were intimately familiar with livestock and the demands of heavy manual labor. They proved to be diligent, skilled workers who often quickly earned the respect of their cowboy overseers. The cowboys, for their part, were often amused and impressed to see these young Germans, who had once been trained in the use of rifles and mortars, now sweating and swearing under the Texas sun as they learned the intricate arts of swinging a lasso or persuading a stubborn longhorn steer to move in the desired direction. The initial wall of mistrust began to erode, replaced by a growing, if unspoken, realization that both sides shared a common bond, a fundamental understanding of and respect for hard work and the land. Of course, cultural clashes were inevitable. The Germans, with their military background, were deeply disciplined and accustomed to rigid schedules, clear chains of command, and meticulous organization. Ranch life, by stark contrast, was loose, pragmatic, and improvisational, shaped entirely by the immediate needs of the moment and the whims of the weather and the livestock. One old cowboy later recalled with a grin, "Those Germans, they'd line up their tools at the end of the day like they were on a parade ground, all neat and tidy. Out here, we just grab what works and get the damn job done. Took 'em a while to get used to that." The background of these PSW camps reveals a profound paradox of the American war effort. The United States had taken its enemy soldiers, the very men who had been trying to kill its sons, and instead of treating them as dangerous pariahs, had integrated them into the economic engine of the home front as a vital labor force. The Texas ranchers, in their quintessentially practical way, began to see the PSWs less as fanatical Nazis and more as able-bodied young men who could help them keep the cattle moving and the crops growing. For the Germans, their captivity in Texas became their first unfiltered, direct glimpse of America. It wasn't the land of decay and disorder their leaders had described. It was a nation of staggering scale, immense resources, and ordinary people who seemed to value sweat and competence more than political slogans. The stage was set for lessons that no amount of propaganda could ever erase. The arithmetic of abundance, numbers that broke the spirit. The lessons the German PSWs learned in Texas were not all taught by cowboys or conveyed through conversation. Some of the most devastating were silent, communicated through the sheer, overwhelming arithmetic of American abundance, a mathematics of scale that quietly, inexorably dismantled their belief in ultimate German victory. In Europe, they had been indoctrinated with the idea that Germany, with its discipline, its willpower, and its superior tactical genius, was destined to prevail. But in Texas, they were forced to confront a different kind of calculation, one measured not in tanks produced or divisions mobilized, but in the number of cattle in a herd, the acres of a single farm, and the sheer volume of food on their own mess hall plates. Start with the labor shortage. By 1944, over 12 million American men were serving in uniform across the globe. The sprawling, labor-intensive ranches of Texas were left critically short-handed. The German PSWs filled this void with stunning efficiency. The nearly 50,000 Germans held in Texas alone would log millions of man-hours in agricultural work. Across the entire United States, the labor provided by all Axis prisoners was equivalent to more than 36,000 full-time workers. It was, in effect, an invisible army, an army of former enemies, now working to keep American food and raw materials flowing freely while the nation's real army fought overseas. Then there was the matter of food, a subject of profound psychological impact. The average German soldier at the front by 1944 was surviving on rations that often amounted to less than 2,000 calories a day, barely enough to sustain a man in combat, let alone one performing heavy labor. In the Texas camps, the prisoners were shocked to find themselves fed a daily ration of nearly 3,200 calories, a diet almost identical to that provided to U.S. troops. Their meals regularly included beef, pork, fresh-baked bread, potatoes, and vegetables. To men who had lived for years on coarse black bread, ersatz coffee, and watery soups, this consistent abundance was nothing short of surreal. The message was brutal in its clarity. America had so much food that it could afford to feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own frontline soldiers. The cattle themselves told a story of staggering scale. Texas ranches during the war years were home to an estimated 10 million head of cattle. The immensity of this single state's livestock industry dwarfed anything the Germans had ever known in Europe. One prisoner, a farmer's son from Bavaria, later wrote in a letter home, "At home, a large and prosperous farm might keep 20 or 30 cows and be the envy of the village. Here, a single rancher counts his herd in the thousands. I have seen more beef in one Texas pasture than in my entire province." This realization carried a painful subtext. America's agricultural capacity was so vast that it could support not only its own population and a global military, but also its prisoners of war, all while Germany's civilian population was slowly starving. Even the economics of their captivity were a source of shock. The PSWs earned 80 cents per day in credit for their labor. While this money was paid to the U.S. government and they received only canteen tokens in return, this still represented more disposable spending power than many German civilians had at home in 1944, where hyperinflation, bombing, and crippling shortages had rendered money nearly worthless and store shelves bare. And perhaps the most devastating number of all was the one that represented American industrial production. Many PSWs arrived in Texas in 1943 and 1944, the very years when American factories were hitting their staggering peak output. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and over 8 million tons of merchant shipping. German officers in captivity, who were sometimes allowed access to American newspapers, realized with a sinking dread what these figures meant for their homeland. Germany, by contrast, produced just 40,000 aircraft in that same year, and was doing so with ever-dwindling supplies of fuel, raw materials, and trained pilots. Even the ranches themselves were a demonstration of production power on a scale the Germans could hardly fathom. The cotton harvests, the wheat shipments, the coordinated cattle drives, all were massive, logistically complex operations carried out with tractors, trucks, and machinery that Germany, with its economy geared entirely toward war and its reliance on horse-drawn transport, could not hope to match. For men raised in a country where farm work still relied heavily on animal muscle and hand tools, Texas agriculture was an industrial enterprise in its own right. These numbers, this silent arithmetic of abundance, cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. Each statistic revealed a painful, inescapable truth. The Reich had promised them supremacy, a 1,000-year future. But here, in the heart of Texas, they saw with their own eyes that America could outproduce, outfeed, and outlast them in every conceivable dimension. For the German PSWs working under the vast Texas sky, the math of their nation's ultimate defeat was no longer an abstract strategic assessment. It was in the herds of cattle that stretched beyond the horizon, the heaping plates of food in the mess halls, the jingle of pay tokens in their pockets, and the hum of machinery in the fields. It was in the undeniable, crushing arithmetic of overwhelming abundance versus desperate scarcity. Numbers, as the saying goes, do not lie. And in Texas, the numbers were telling the German prisoners that their war was already lost. Becoming cowboys. The transformation through sweat and skill. The first time a particular group of German PSWs was ordered onto a flatbed truck and driven out to a working cattle ranch, they were convinced it was an elaborate ruse. They expected the pretense of labor to collapse into armed drills, forced marches, or some form of backbreaking punishment detail. Instead, they were simply handed shovels, fence posts, wire stretchers, and heavy sacks of feed. The ranch foreman, a man of few words, gave them a brief, practical demonstration, driving a post, splicing a wire, tossing a feed sack, his movements economical and effortless. He spoke in his slow, drawn-out Texas dialect, incomprehensible to his audience, then simply pointed at the pile of tools and gestured toward a long section of broken-down fence line. The message was universally understood: get to work. Initially, there was resistance, a deep-seated pride revolting against the task. These were men of the Wehrmacht. They had fought for the fatherland, worn the national eagle on their uniforms, and been part of the most fearsome military machine in European history. To be ordered to perform the work of common farmhands felt, to some, like a profound and calculated humiliation. A handful refused outright to touch the tools, standing stiffly with their arms crossed, insisting through the translator that such labor was beneath their station as soldiers. But the twin forces of hunger and soul-crushing boredom are powerful motivators. The men who refused to work received no canteen tokens and were given only the most basic rations. Furthermore, the alternative to work was a return to the stifling monotony of the camp barracks. Within a few hours, pride began to crumble. One by one, the reluctant prisoners picked up hammers and wire cutters, their movements clumsy and uncertain at first, slowly beginning to mimic the practiced, efficient actions of the watching cowboys. It did not take long for this initial, sullen disbelief to give way to a grudging, then genuine respect for the work itself. Ranch life, they quickly discovered, was brutally, fundamentally hard. The Texas sun was an unforgiving adversary, beating down with an intensity that men from the milder climates of Europe found physically draining. The distances were immense. A short ride to check on a remote herd could mean hours of jolting travel across rough, trackless land. And the cattle themselves, particularly the legendary Texas Longhorns, were nothing like the docile, stall-kept dairy cows of Bavaria or the Black Forest. These animals were massive, stubborn, semi-wild, and could be dangerously unpredictable, requiring a blend of skill, courage, and sheer physical strength to manage. One young prisoner, a former theology student named Dieter, confided in his post-war diary, "I had fought in the dust of Tunisia, marched across the burning hills of Sicily, and survived naval bombardments. I thought I knew hardship. Yet it was here, in Texas, chasing a half-ton steer that could easily crush a man against a fence post, that I truly understood I was no longer a soldier. I was being transformed into something else entirely, a laborer, a worker of the land, and there was a strange, unexpected dignity in it." For the cowboys, those first days were just as strange and fraught with conflicting emotions. Many of these Texans had brothers, sons, or nephews fighting overseas against the very regime these prisoners represented. They had been conditioned by wartime rhetoric to expect the Germans to be arrogant, fanatical, and potentially violent. Instead, what they saw stepping cautiously off the trucks were often skinny, tired-looking young men, many of them barely out of their teens, who flinched at the snort of a horse and fumbled comically with barbed wire. The ideological monster of the Nazi began to dissolve, replaced by the far more human reality of the boy. As one grizzled cowboy later remarked, "They weren't monsters. Hell, they were just kids, same as my boy over in France. They just got caught on the wrong side. Out here, when the sun's baking your brain and you're both covered in the same dust and sweat, all that other stuff just kinda fades away. Work makes you all the same." The PSWs soon discovered that their captors operated on a straightforward, almost transactional code of honor. If a man worked hard, didn't complain excessively, and pulled his weight, he was rewarded with decent food, adequate rest, and a basic level of respect. They were given regular water breaks, offered shade during the hottest part of the day, and sometimes, as the weeks turned into months, even shared a joke or a shared moment of frustration with the ranch hands. The cowboys would often joke that the Germans were free labor with funny accents, but in private, some admitted that the prisoners' discipline and willingness to learn reminded them of their own younger selves. By the end of their first week, the PSWs had acquired a basic, functional skill set. They learned how to properly set a fence post in the rocky soil, how to stretch and staple barbed wire without tearing their hands to shreds, how to drive a herd without causing a stampede, and how to heave a 50-pound feed sack without spilling half its contents. Their bodies ached in new and peculiar ways. Muscles they never knew they had screamed in protest. Their hands became a tapestry of blisters and calluses. But alongside the physical exhaustion came a dawning sense of purpose. They began to sense, intuitively, that these Americans did not harbor a deep ideological hatred for them. They were not treated as subhuman embodiments of evil, but simply as men who could, with guidance, pull their weight in a demanding and necessary enterprise. The first real field test of this strange new arrangement often came during a large-scale cattle drive. The Germans would be loaded into trucks before dawn and driven out to a vast section of open range where hundreds of cattle had to be gathered and moved into holding pens for branding or shipment. The initial scene was invariably one of pure, unadulterated chaos. Cattle would bolt in every direction, dust would cloud the air so thickly it was hard to see, and the PSWs, shouting to each other in German, would stumble over prairie dog holes and cactus, trying desperately to follow the shouted, incomprehensible orders of the cowboys. The cowboys themselves, meanwhile, were a spectacle of breathtaking skill, riding effortlessly through the melee on their sure-footed horses, their lassos spinning in graceful arcs before snaking out to catch a runaway calf, their sharp, piercing whistles cutting through the din as they communicated with each other and their dogs. But by the end of the day, something would have shifted. The prisoners, though exhausted and filthy, would have contributed. They had helped turn the herd, had blocked off escape routes, had learned to work as a team in this new, alien environment. Their hands were raw, their uniforms were soaked through with sweat and dust, but they had played a tangible part in a monumental task. That night, back in the camp barracks, over a dinner of beef stew and cornbread, the conversations would be different. The tone of disbelief was replaced by one of weary accomplishment. "This is not the captivity we were told to expect," one prisoner might say to another. "It is labor, yes, hard labor, but it carries a strange and undeniable dignity." The Germans had been sent to Texas as prisoners of war, but their first weeks on the ranch revealed a startling truth. They were not just being put to work, they were, in a very real sense, being turned into cowboys. The cowboy as teacher. Lessons in freedom and practicality. If the sheer, back-breaking labor of ranch work began to break down the Germans' physical resistance, it was the cowboy culture itself, the ethos, the attitude, the very way of being, that fundamentally reshaped how they thought about America and Americans. Initially, many of the PSWs, particularly those from urban or aristocratic backgrounds, viewed the cowboys as rustic, uneducated simpletons, fortunate to have been born in a land of plenty but lacking the sophistication and culture of Europe. This condescension, however, was short-lived. The longer they worked side by side with these men, the more complex and impressive the picture became. The cowboys were not merely herders of animals. They were a complete, self-reliant package. They were mechanics who could diagnose and repair a balky truck engine with a piece of baling wire and a hammer. They were veterinarians who could expertly deliver a calf or set a broken leg on a horse. They were logisticians who could plan the movement of a 1,000-head herd across 50 miles of trackless land. And they were shrewd businessmen who understood the complexities of the cattle market. To men trained in the rigid, top-down hierarchies of the German military and society, the cowboy was a fascinating paradox. Fiercely independent, yet capable of seamless teamwork, rough in manners, yet possessing a deep, almost intuitive knowledge, and disciplined not by external command, but by an internalized code of necessity and pride. The language barrier, once a formidable wall, began to crumble with remarkable speed. The cowboys, with a natural pedagogue's patience, taught the German prisoners the English words for the tools and tasks of their shared world. Post-hole digger, branding iron, wrangle, stampede, saddle horn. The Germans, in turn, taught their captors German words for the same objects, shared folk songs from their homeland, and offered their own tricks and techniques for repairs, many learned on the small, diversified farms of pre-war Europe. Soon, the work sites and the camps echoed with a peculiar hybrid patois, a mix of guttural German and drawn-out Texan slang, a new language born from the immediate necessities of cooperation and shared experience. What struck the PSWs most profoundly, and perhaps most subversively to their prior indoctrination, was the American attitude toward work itself. In the Germany they had known, labor was often seen as a duty to be endured, a command from a higher authority to be obeyed without question. In Texas, they encountered a culture where work was inextricably linked with personal pride. The cowboys didn't boast about their military rank or family lineage. They boasted about tangible, measurable achievements. How many cattle they had moved in a single day, how quickly they had repaired a broken windmill, how cleanly they could rope and brand a steer. The Germans began to grasp, on a visceral level, that a significant portion of America's formidable strength was rooted in this cultural bedrock, a widespread belief that honest, productive labor was not a humiliation to be suffered, but a source of honor to be celebrated. Then there was the matter of the food, which became a source of legend and continual astonishment among the prisoners. Ranch meals were feasts of almost mythical proportions. Breakfast consisted of platters of bacon and eggs, stacks of fluffy biscuits smothered in gravy, and pots of coffee so strong the Germans joked it could dissolve a spoon. The midday meal, eaten out on the range, might be a thick, spicy chili with slabs of cornbread. Suppers were often enormous steaks, pots of pinto beans, and homemade pies the size of wagon wheels. For men whose recent memories were of meager, monotonous wartime rations in a blockaded Germany, this daily abundance was disorienting. Even more disorienting was the casual, unthinking generosity with which it was provided. The cowboys and their families often shared these meals directly with the PSWs, treating them less like despised enemies and more like temporary, albeit unusual, members of the ranch's extended family. It was around the campfires in the evening, after the plates were cleared, that the most significant cultural exchanges took place. The cowboys, their curiosity piqued, would ask the prisoners about life in Germany, about their families, their hometowns, their trades before the war, and cautiously about what ordinary Germans really thought of Hitler and the Nazi Party. The prisoners, in turn, emboldened by this openness, would ask their captors why America had chosen to fight a war so far from its own shores, and why it had intervened in what many Germans still viewed as a primarily European conflict. The answers the PSWs received were rarely couched in high-minded political rhetoric or ideological jargon. The cowboys spoke in simple, direct, and deeply personal terms. They spoke of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a sneak punch that demanded a response. They spoke of friends, brothers, and sons who had gone off to fight, and of a fundamental, ingrained belief that a man shouldn't let a bully take over his neighbor's house because sooner or later, that bully's going to come for yours. These plain-spoken, heartfelt explanations planted powerful seeds of doubt in the minds of the prisoners. They had been raised on a steady diet of propaganda that portrayed Americans as decadent, weak-willed, and motivated solely by greed. Yet here they were, living and working alongside men who lived simply, worked with a ferocious intensity, and treated even their enemies with a rough but genuine sense of fairness and decency. A small but growing number of prisoners began to quietly wonder, often for the first time, if they had been fighting for a flawed and monstrous cause, for a vision of the future that was built on lies. The cultural lessons extended far beyond politics and ideology. The Germans watched with something akin to awe as the cowboys demonstrated a level of resourcefulness that bordered on magic. A boot worn through at the sole would be expertly patched with scraps of leather and a few hobnails, making it last another full season. A lasso that had frayed and snapped would be meticulously spliced and knotted back together until it was nearly as strong as new. Nothing on the ranch was ever thrown away if it could possibly be repaired, yet nothing was treated with excessive reverence. Tools existed to be used, hard, and then maintained for the next use. For PSWs coming from a society often obsessed with rigid order, ritual, and the appearance of perfection, this relentless, unpretentious practicality was both refreshing and deeply humbling. and underpinning it all was the intoxicating, palpable aura of freedom. The cowboys embodied it in their every gesture, their very posture. They answered to no officer's barked commands, offered no daily salutes to a superior. Their authority was earned, not bestowed. It came from a demonstrated mastery of skill, not from the stripes on a sleeve or the rank on a collar. A man who could single-handedly rope the wildest steer in the herd or ride calmly through the most violent thunderstorm earned the unwavering respect of his peers without ever needing to demand it. The PSWs saw this and recognized a form of power and personal agency they had never truly known, a power that was not imposed from above, but granted from below by mutual consent. It was a power born of competence, not command. By the end of 1944, many German PSWs would admit in quiet conversations that the Texas ranchers and cowboys had taught them more about the true nature of America than any guard tower, propaganda film, or political speech ever could. These men were not the grotesque caricatures of Nazi imagination. They were the living, breathing human face of a nation that had managed to forge a unique and powerful synthesis of individual freedom with collective discipline, of immense abundance with a Protestant work ethic. For men who had once been taught to believe they were the heirs to Europe's mightiest and most superior cultural tradition, this slow dawning revelation cut deeper and would ultimately prove more lasting than any battlefield defeat. America, they were forced to concede, had built not just a powerful army, but a formidable and admirable way of life. A way of life that even its prisoners, in the depths of their captivity, could not help but respect. The legacy of an unlikely respect. By the time the war in Europe entered its final convulsive months in late 1944 and early 1945, the initial brittle skepticism that had defined the German prisoners' arrival in Texas had undergone a profound metamorphosis. It had softened, matured, and given way to something far more complex and enduring, a mutual respect. What had begun as a relationship of captor and captive, fraught with fear and ideological baggage, had slowly, almost imperceptibly, transformed into one of working partners, and in many cases, genuine friendship and a deep mutual admiration between the prisoners, their guards, and the cowboy ranchers. The barriers had been formidable at the start. The PSWs arrived expecting brutality. They had been psychologically prepared for whips, starvation, and humiliation, the standard treatment they believed awaited prisoners in the hands of a decadent and vengeful enemy. The reality they encountered was a shock to their system. Instead of cruelty, they found a system that, while firm and disciplined, was imbued with a surprising degree of humanity. Instead of starvation, they were given cigarettes and work assignments that, while demanding, offered purpose and small rewards. The American Guards played a pivotal and often understated role in this transformation. Many of these guards were young men themselves, often from rural American backgrounds not so different from the rural origins of many of the German prisoners. They knew little German, and the prisoners knew little English, but the universal language of shared labor, of a nod, a pointed finger, a shared laugh at a comical mistake, began to build bridges of basic human understanding. One German prisoner, a former auto mechanic from Hamburg, later recalled, "The guard assigned to watch over our work detail was a boy from Oklahoma, maybe 19 years old. He saw me struggling with a piece of machinery, a hydraulic lift on a truck that was unlike anything I'd seen. He walked over, not with a threat, but with a smile, and showed me how it worked. We both laughed when I fumbled with it the first time. In that moment, I was not a prisoner, and he was not a guard. We were just two young men figuring out